where do you want us to sit? Well, Bob ought to be closest probably to the podium.
So he's going to be standing in the podium.
Yeah. Got it.
Maybe I sit here. Am I supposed to be in the middle?
You sit there.
I sit in the middle?
Yes. In fact, I'm coming, you're still doing the CCS thing tomorrow, yes? Is there not some meeting on CCS in the center tomorrow?
Oh yes, yeah, that is for Alyssa Park's conference.
So I was going to come to that.
Yeah.
You had me wondering for a second there.
It was. I know all about CCS stuff, but it's just that's okay. No. The reason why I didn't put it in that bin is that the first Wednesday of every month we have a professor come and talk, and they give on some subject of their interest. And so this one is Alyssa just talking about the CCS stuff.
But I so rarely get to come here that I might as well do all these fun things while I'm here.
Speaking of which, let me know if you want to hang out. Let me know if you want to hang out at all. I have a surprisingly large, flexible amount of time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to definitely show up early before the lunch tomorrow.
How you doing, my friend?
Should I sit near Bob? He might kick me if I do.
Yeah, Bob, or... yeah, sure. Give me a Bob.
Oh, no, I was only joking.
Oh, okay.
I'm a safe distance now.
Yeah.
Put the phone on airplane mode.
Right, let me see a sheet. Let me ask Kitten for the... Okay, so I think we're going to get started. Thanks very much for coming tonight. This is a panel of the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia University. And we're here to celebrate the second anniversary of the release of Bob McNally's book on volatility in oil markets, which is the first book edited by the Columbia University Energy Series under the auspices of the center. Bob is, to my left, best known as the drummer for the band Sound Policy, which is performing Friday in Bethesda. But he also dabbles in unsound policy at his times. And he did it for the George W. Bush administration a few years ago. Since then, he's been first in a hedge fund, and over the last few years, he's been running his own consultancy, the Rapidan Group, or Rapidan Energy Group in Washington. He's a non-resident fellow of the center, as are my other neighbors to my right. Marianne Carr, who most of you will know as the former chief economist of Conoco, and a very active scholar here at the center, doing a lot of work on transportation and transportation fuels. And Jamie Webster, who comes from the consulting side of the business. So Marianne mostly from industry, Jamie from consulting. All of my three co-participants tonight are lifelong or career-long OPEC watchers and market watchers with deep expertise and deep experience in the oil market. It's a good time to discuss the oil market because, as we always say, we're at a crossroads. Things are changing. Things have never been as dynamic as they are today. It's always true, but it's truer now than it's been in the past, probably less than tomorrow, but very much true at the moment. It's also a good time to revisit the thesis of Bob McNally. So I've known Bob McNally for maybe 20 years, so I've known his slides for probably 20 years. But when the shale revolution took off, it really gave his slide a big boost and resulted in a very important book that had a big influence, probably a bestseller for academic books on the topic. But this was a few years ago when the shale revolution was still young. Shale now is changing. It's shale 102 or 201 or 202. It's not quite the same shale industry as it was when the book came out. So it's a good time to test again the hypothesis and the thesis that Bob presented. So the event will essentially proceed in 3 steps or 2 steps. Bob will first discuss a few of his ideas, show some version of his slides, and then Marianne and Jamie will pipe in with their comments, and from there we'll go to a sort of moderated discussion, not only of Bob's book, but of the market today and the outlook for the market.
Great, thank you.
So I should say that this event is recorded and live streamed, and it's possible to ask questions on Twitter and submit questions that way.
Thank you very much, Antoine. Thank you all for coming. Our goal is to break up before the State of the Union, right? That's right. I want to thank Marianne and Jamie as well as Antoine, folks I've known for combined decades and whose experience and knowledge of the oil industry I deeply, deeply respect and appreciate. You know, I was speaking about it earlier, writing a book is my first book. And I didn't realize what a team effort it is. And it's not just the folks who helped you on the book, and it's so much more than a great editor I had and so forth, but your professional colleagues, and Jan Stewart and others are in the crowd here, people who've helped build your knowledge over the years too, so I'm very appreciative. And I want to say thank you and how happy I am to be a non-resident fellow at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, and to Jason Bordoff, who had my job for the President Obama, and I'm so glad to be a Republican, I guess, representative here on the staff. And so grateful for Jason for encouraging me to write the book and promoting it along with his colleagues here. I also want to recognize my intrepid book research assistant, Fernando Ferreira. Fernando, would you please stand up? Fernando was really the brains and the brawn behind this book. We realize when we talk about crude oil price volatility, the word volatility really doesn't capture the essence of what I'm talking about, because we're talking about swings in prices whose amplitude and causes we haven't seen in 9 decades. And to get a picture of that, we had to build a crude oil price series monthly going all the way back to 1859. We also decided we need more spare capacity data than we can get online from EIA and others, and so Fernando was instrumental, among other things, in building that spare capacity database. So, and he is now a colleague of mine at Rapidan Energy Group. Check him out after if you want to really know what's going on in Venezuela. He's got the goods. And I'm here also with my colleague Leslie Hayward, who recently joined us as a friend and former client who does our business development. So I hope you'll say hello to Leslie and Fernando after the talk. Okay, let's go on here. What I was hoping to do is first figure out how to work this device. There we go. And then sort of summarize the questions the book attempted to answer and address, and then look forward a little bit. And I do look forward, and I want to get right to the Q&A and your comments and questions. Now, first of all, you say, well, Bob, you wrote a book saying crude oil prices are volatile? Please. I mean, what? That is not new news. Everybody, you know, folks with more gray hair than me know you've been up and been down. I mean, let's move on to the State of the Union if that's all you're going to talk about. And I say, well, wait a minute, though. The volatility we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years we haven't seen in modern times. You never see a quintupling in prices like we did from 03 to 05. Without a war in the Persian Gulf, you just don't see those big moves without some sort of geopolitical catalyst. It could be an actual disruption, fear, or both, hoarding, so forth, since the 1970s without a war. And you just don't see a 60% collapse in 6 months, as we saw in late 2014, early 2015, without either a recession or somebody deliberately gunning the supply of oil suddenly, which Saudi Arabia did in 1986. That's the exception that proves the rule. So this is what made me write the book, is seeing this price behavior and saying something else is going on. We don't have the usual suspects that caused these price spikes in the early 70s, the late 70s, the Gulf War, and recessions that caused it. Something else is going on, and we got to figure out what it is. And what my research really showed, first of all, is we need to remind ourselves why oil as a commodity is especially prone to wild boom-bust price cycles or big price swings. And that gets into the inelasticity of supply and demand to price in the short run, and storage can help moderate that but can't solve it. And so that's all in Chapter 4. So we kind of walk through and say, let's just step back for a second and say, oil is especially prone when market forces are working toward wild oil price swings. And the next idea is that when oil transitioned or graduated from an illumination to a transportation fuel 100 and some years ago, it suddenly became the lifeblood of modern civilization. So now we have the most important commodity in the world, other than food, but essential for food production, that is prone to unacceptable swings in prices. And you put those two things together, and then the experience of boom-bust eras we've had in the past, and you get to what that picture shows, which is a Texas governor from a state that is the most dedicated to free markets and keeping government out of the affairs of business decisions, sending troops into the fields to prod drillers away from their property at bayonet point, and then create and install the most effective Maoist, centralized, heavy-handed control of private sector I think we've ever seen on the planet, the Texas Railroad Commission, which kept oil prices stable. Please ignore the shameless plug. I don't know how that got in there for the book. That's uncalled for. So what we did is we built this series, Fernando and I. We took monthly prices going all the way back to 1859, and what we saw is that oil prices, never perfectly stable, but were unusually volatile during periods when there was no swing producer or some entity that stepped in, commercial, government, or both, and said, we're going to put a stop to this nonsense. We're going to introduce what naturally doesn't exist in the oil market, which is a very flexible supplier. And our goal, and our sole goal, is to anchor long-term prices so that investors don't overinvest, the industry can have certainty, and then all the consumers and all the central bank planners and all the defense departments and everybody else who relies on oil can be reasonably certain of a price range for oil. Because without that, the world doesn't work well. But to do that in the short run, we have to be like a central bank. We have to be able, meaning legally authorized too, able, willing to quickly, meaning weeks, adjust supply up, which is the fun part, down, which is the not fun part, and hold it there for a long time to convince investors that we are committed to this price target. That's the secret sauce. And my book concluded the reason you saw this, you've seen this unusually wide amplitude of prices recently, and the usual suspects, wars and recessions, not causing those, is what you have is supply and demand with no effective swing producer. OPEC is AWOL. And so we attempted to do some metrics on this. Fernando and I took our monthly price series, and we took the range during a year, and we looked at the percentage change in that range, and then we averaged it over our eras. So what we saw is you had first boom-bust era, the average range was 53%. Mr. Rockefeller, the first swing producer, did it indirectly through refining and midstream, comes in, crushes it in half. We bust up Standard Oil, don't like evil corporate titans like him. Back to boom-bust, the last prolonged boom-bust period, from 1911, the breakup of Standard Oil, until 1932. And then the Texas come in, bayonets and all, Mao Zedong, and they crushed oil price volatility. They pinned prices. And we'll show shortly, the most fundamentally unbalanced decade, I believe, in the history of the oil market where supply and demand were most out of whack was the 1950s. We brought all those Middle East fields on board, and we hadn't had the 60s demand and 70s demand take off. And you'll see that with the spare capacity numbers. Yet it was probably the most boring decade for price movements. Why? The Texas Railroad Commission, Seven Sisters, extremely forceful and careful control of production. So what can we say going forward? I think we can say that we have two ways to think about the price of oil, the range over the long term. There's controlled when an effective swing producer comes in and says, we're going to pin it from here between this range. And we have the tools and the ability to willing to do so. If you don't have that, the range we should expect for oil prices through the medium to long-term cycles is shut in to demand destruction. These are the things that are politically unacceptable, but that's what they are, shut in and demand destructions. So if we have a swing producer going forward, maybe it'll be OPEC plus. We'll talk about that in a second. Maybe it'll be shale, some people say. What the world really needs is someone to come in and say, okay, that was enough of that roller coaster ride. The third boom-bust era is officially over. We're here, and we're going to impose a $60 to $80 Brent price range for the next 30 years. Everybody plan on that. We'd all be very happy, I think, except for perhaps some hedge funds, successful traders and storage owners. Everybody else would be very happy with that. If we don't have that, we're going to have, I think, single to teens up into the hundreds through these cycles. So the world right now, in my view, needs a swing producer. There's a chart long-term showing oil supply and demand from Equinor. BP is the history and Equinor is the projections. And everyone has their different projections, and is peak demand real? Will EVs take off? And we can debate that all day. But with the world's middle class rising from, a billion to 2 or 3 billion, and of this, the population going 7 to 10, and everyone seeming to like to drive and food and plastics and all that kind of stuff, safe bet there's a lot of demand coming for oil, and we're not sure where we're going to get all the new supply from. And the one thing we do really need, though, and would help and balance that market is to have, and to keep geopolitics and macroeconomic stability, is a swing producer to come in and provide that price stability that Rockefeller did, that enabled kerosene to explode, and the Texas Railroad Commission and Seven Sisters did to let gasoline explode. Now remember, the first cars were electric. And in 1900, a third of the cars were electric, a third were ethanol, and a third were gasoline. Gasoline was not an obvious natural winner. One of the reasons gasoline was a winner in the race for transportation, one of the reasons, is because the oil industry and the Texas Railroad Commission came together and promised the investors in cars that we could provide abundant, stably priced oil for a long time. We really need that going forward. All right, who are the candidates? We need a swing producer. We've heard two recently since the book came out. One is U.S. shale, and the other is, I guess, OPEC plus, for want of a better name. I know they're searching for a new name and an organization. They're going to be meeting on that this weekend. Maybe we can get into the shale discussion in the panel. I think the jury is sort of in, and the verdict is pretty clear. In my view, shale oil is in no way, shape, or form a replacement for the Texas Railroad Commission or OPEC as it should have functioned as a swing producer. It has none of the qualities I just listed. Legally and able to act quickly over a long duration with the sole goal of stabilizing prices, not maximizing profits. It has none of that. It is more flexible than conventional upstream production. Yes, it is more flexible, and I think there's an argument to be had, or a debate, over whether that flexibility adds to or contributes to long-term prices and the amplitude of the price swings. I think we can have a debate there. Long story short, if we're not going to have peak demand and shale oil is going to scare off other upstream investment, shale could be contributing to long-term price volatility by denying us the investment we'll need in 5 to 7 years when peak demand turns out to have been wishful thinking. Just one theory. Maybe not. The other and the more likely replacement, in my view, to provide, and this is going to shale. Let me go back to shale in a second. I think the recent history has shown shale's sort of onrush has been both stabilizing and destabilizing, which is one reason why I think you can have a debate. From 1910 to 2010 to 13, shale oil was boomed up to 2010 there. You can see it up there, 11 to 13. Shale was stabilizing for us, I believe. We were sanctioning Iran's exports. Spare capacity was very tight. Demand was robust. I think we would have gone back into the triple digits had it not been for shale showing up. And that just happened to coincide fortuitously there. But then, in my view, shale's continued onrush was destabilizing, in part because Saudi Arabia refused to cut underneath it, famously on Thanksgiving Day in 2014. And the Russians also refused to go along with Saudi Arabian cuts, and down we went ultimately to $26 a barrel. So I don't think, I'm not going to say shale caused the collapse, but shale was a contributing factor to the collapse in prices. Shale, again, this is what caused these collapses since the very first days, onrush of new supply that's outside the swing producer. The swing producer proves ineffective in meeting that, and the price then goes into boom-bust mode. So I really think we're looking for a swing producer. I make the point here that now some folks say, well, OPEC plus is it. And how to think about this new Russian-Saudi alliance. Are they the new kind of swing producer? Will they be the fourth producer? I think the jury in this case is out. We don't know for sure. It's possible. There are two ways to think about swing producers. Every time prices bust, you get a swing producer. Fear impels the oil industry to collaborate. The first swing producer was called the Oil Creek Association. It formed in November of 1861 during the very first oil price boom. They all swore, the producers in Pennsylvania, to not exceed the limits until oil prices got back to $4 a barrel. They pledged their sacred honor. They signed papers they published in the newspapers. It lasted about 4 months. And over history, and even through boom-bust eras, you've seen price busts. Sort of, they say cartels are the children of crisis, of a crisis. Well, so are these swing producers. So on the one hand, OPEC, remember, what changed things around was in February of 2016 when crude prices fell to $26 a barrel. And it would have kept falling, in my view, had not Minister Novak from Russia said, okay, we've had enough pain, Russia is willing to cut. And then Minister Naimi from Saudi Arabia said, well, fine, if you're willing to cut, then we're willing to cut. So let's talk about cuts. And whoosh, the price went right back up. So once again, a price bust scared the stuffing out of producers and impelled a swing producer organization. The question is, will they be long-lived, like the Texas Railroad Commission and OPEC, or will they be more of a flash in the pan, like the Oil Creek Association, the Petroleum Producers Association in the late 1870s, et cetera? Now, a lot of folks say, well, haven't you seen? We had this inventory oversupply, and it cleaned up pretty nicely. We're back to kind of stable, normal prices, and that was because of these cuts that Russia and Saudi Arabia put through. Ergo, we seem to have an effective swing producer. Again, we can debate that all night. I think they no doubt played a role. The cutbacks, mainly by Saudi Arabia, played a role. But the real reason those inventories cleaned up in the second half were a series of tragedies, which once again came to the aid of the oil industry, starting with massive, once-in-a-lifetime storms and the knocking out of a third of U.S. refining capacity, Harvey and Nate, and then prolonged outages in the Keystone and 40s pipeline system. To throw in just for a little cherry on top, the KRG thought it would be a good idea to declare independence. It was promptly invaded, and we lost 300,000 barrels a day of Iraqi supply. All this helped to clean up. So I think OPEC plus, the Saudi OPEC cuts, played a role, but they had a lot of help from their friends, disaster and tragedy, in lowering those inventories and cleaning up the market. So here again, I want to sort of put up a comparison table and ask ourselves, you know, what are the characteristics of an effective swing producer based on the research we've done? And there's a whole argument, by the way, the free market can do this. We may hear this tonight, that you don't even need government, that you should just let the free market, and this was debated in the 20s and the 50s, and we can have that debate. And I'm not arguing that's wrong or right. I'm just kind of dissecting history. From history, here's the characteristics of a swing producer. Shale has none of them. OPEC plus, maybe. And maybe we can talk about that. I'm willing to be, either if OPEC plus, and they're talking this weekend about getting married and formally becoming like having an organization and everything and a building, and if they do that and they get together time and they form an organization that is regularly able to adjust supply and convince the market they can anchor prices, then the third boom-bust era identified in my book will have ended, and the OPEC plus, or whatever they're going to call themselves, era will have started. I've listed a bunch of issues here, but in the interest of time, and I really want to get to my panelists and hear from you, I'm just going to leave them out and say maybe we can talk about them. They have to get to what's moving the market now. I think President Trump has arrived as a very important factor in the oil markets. with regard to geopolitical risk and OPEC that is underappreciated. There's an honorable mention for IMO 2020, and the one thing that's not mentioned here that I should have is Canada. Let me end with that. Again, I'm a conservative Republican. I tend to believe in letting market forces work, but I wrote a book basically saying, wow, sometimes it seems supply control is a necessary evil because the alternative is this volatility that no one's stomach can really seem to handle. So I have sympathy for when governments intervene in supply control. And Canada has done that. Alberta, the province of Alberta has done that. But you know, I think there's a difference. With Alberta, the issue is not about stabilizing the global or even regional oil market for the benefit of the oil industry, the economy, the users of oil, and broader sectors in policymaking that rely crucially on stable energy prices. That is not the reason. The reason they had to intervene is because Canada can't agree to build pipelines to get that oil out. And so that problem has to be fixed. So I think it's in a little bit of a different box. Glad to see those curtailments end, but I think it's an interesting, from perspective of the book and what's happened, again, never underestimate the lengths to which even free market-oriented folks will go to put an end to boom-bust oil prices. With that, I thank you for your attention. I really look forward to the commentary and the questions. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Bob. That was great. So I will not use my prerogative as moderator to immediately jump in. There's a lot of food for thought there and a lot of things to disagree with. But first, I will turn to Jamie, because I think, Jamie, you have a view that actually volatility, depending on how you measure it, how you define it, is actually down over the last few years compared to what it was before shale.
Yeah, thanks, Antoine. And Bob, thanks for writing this book a couple of years ago. I've enjoyed buying, as I told you before, 3 copies because of a variety of reasons. I did reread it and made a couple of notes on my latest copy, just to see where you got some things right. But Antoine is right. So a couple of comments. So I agree with you on your long-term views on volatility. But one of the things that we've been talking about in the market over the last few years, and I will say that I also, as shale came in, I was like, we're going to be looking for a more volatile period. But if you look at volatility, and you have a way of looking at it, there's lots of other ways as well, is that actually it seemed like oil was in a slightly more volatile frame of mind from 2010 until the price decline. If you looked at it in terms of, which I think is similar to what you look at, which is basically the range, and how much did it range over that year. The difference is that it really, at that point, because prices were, then we're talking about 90 to 110 or whatever, that was where that volatility was really hitting consumers, and so it was impacting, do I want to buy an SUV or do I want to buy a small car, versus for the oil companies, it was at these prices, I'm making a lot of money or I'm making not quite so much money, and my costs are going up because I can afford this. Now we're back we're at this lower period, and actually volatility to me seems, if you look at the numbers, is actually slightly lower on a kind of annualized basis. If you compare those two periods, kind of 2010 to 2013 and 2015 to 2018, and we'll ignore 2014 because it was so crazy. But I think the difference is that this time it is now impacting the oil companies in that, if you're paying $2.90 or $3 for gas, it doesn't quite change so much if you're going to jump from Tesla to the other. But for oil companies, it is crossing frequently that kind of cost of projects, which is making it very difficult for the investors and for the boards to try to decide how things are going to look. And so actually, I think just strictly on looking at it from a volatility standpoint, I would say it actually seems to be lower, but it is hitting in a way that for the industry is very difficult. And you raised some really good points about peak demand, which is also, I think, playing into this. But I think it's in a very difficult time. And that volatility was really hitting consumers before, but it's hitting producers now, which is why I think my second point, which is that you're seeing, I'm not quite on we're going to go to market, but I do think we're moving to a slightly different thing. So you described shale 2010 to 2013 as a stabilizing force, and that if we hadn't had it, prices would have gone up. But as you also know, that it wasn't just one of the big major things. If you hadn't, you had Libya production go offline. We had Saudi Arabia come in and put on more production. You had the Iran sanctions. If any one of those four had not happened, prices would have arguably gone to 147 or down to the prices that we saw in 2014. And so to me, as I look at now and I look at the intercessions in Canada, I look at the sanctions on Iran, I look at what's happening with Venezuela, I see, OPEC saying, oh, we're gonna increase production. No, we're gonna decrease production. There's an increase in these intercessions, which leads me to believe, okay, well, maybe we're actually moving not to who is the single swing supplier and not maybe to a full-on market environment, but definitely something where you're in a much more, multiple realms of power that can end up impacting the market, which makes our job much more difficult. And obviously, we'll have to charge significantly more for this sort of analysis. But again, thank you for the book, and appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
I'd like to comment on that also, and that I think shale is still a stabilizing force in one perspective, and that is you have a lot of short-term volatility because they've become the de facto balancing factor. It's unintentional, but these producers live hand to mouth. So if there's too much production in the market, the price needs to drop to get them to stop investing. And when there's not enough, the price goes up. Well, that is short-term volatility by definition. So I agree that they have increased short-term volatility. But the excursions outside the mean or outside a $50 to $65 price range are going to be much less, and they won't last more than 10 months because that's about the full cycle time at most it will take to respond to price changes. So in some senses, the price is actually much more stable in a longer term sense than it has been in the past. The other comment I'll make about OPEC is that it's not clear that they have ever truly been effective at managing prices. A true swing supplier would come in before you have inventories build up and would act preemptively. They cannot do that. They can only act, as you said, in emergencies. So they do not really make a good swing supplier. In fact, I'm the free market person he was probably referring to earlier. I believe that most interventions one could make to try to get rid of the volatility will add another source of uncertainty and actually will make the volatility worse, becoming another unknown. So let's try not to make the situation worse. I feel like we've had the same conversation last year, and somebody in the audience said, but if the consumers are upset because gasoline is up $1, you have to do something. So I think policymakers ought to try to minimize the damage of what governments feel like they have to do in that situation. And I would also say, coming from an oil company, it's true, the smaller producers live hand to mouth, and they will, swing their production up and down because they don't have the cash to invest. But the larger companies invest over a 10-year time horizon, 5 to 10 years. So any single price in any one year or an extreme doesn't impact investment decisions as much as you would think. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you.
So if I can jump in, your book, Bob, is very much a history of the oil industry through the oil price. It's all about the price, and that's the prism through which you see the whole history of the industry. OPEC itself often describes its role today as one of price stabilization. They want to stabilize prices. But I kind of wonder if we're not putting too much faith in that self-description, if we should really take OPEC at face value when it says that that's what it wants to do, and if we're not overemphasizing the role in price in the oil industry. You said yourself that in the 50s, supply and demand were in complete imbalance, yet the price was stable because the Texas Railroad Commission was very strong at managing the market. But should then the price stability be the real benchmark, or should the supply-demand balance be the benchmark? And a couple of points. In a way, I kind of wonder if the big swings in prices we've seen recently, what you call volatility, is really an expression of OPEC's lack of power, of OPEC's failure, or of OPEC's power and ability to inflict major pain on the market by pushing the price up and making production completely inefficient, and then pushing the price down and wiping out all the inefficient producers. In that sense, OPEC has been extremely efficient in the last few years. They haven't wiped out shale because shale didn't turn out to be the low-cost producer, the high-cost producer. But they've wiped out Canada. They wiped out Venezuela, which is a high-cost producer today. So they've done a really good job, and I don't really see why they have a problem.
Okay. Thank you very much for those comments. I guess just a few responses and then open to discussion? Okay. No, Jamie, I take your point, and had I wanted to use some more time and pull back up the price chart, a phenomenon that we see in this and prior boom-bust eras are interludes of stability. I call them new normals, right? They're the new normal. There was the $90 to $100 new normal that affected consumers. There was the 45 new normal, and I think we're kind of in a 60 new normal. So you've seen that if you look at the monthly price series, even in the 1860s and 70s, when we're in booming and busting, you'd often get 2 or 3 years of relatively stable prices. Same goes in the 19 teens and 20s. I don't know exactly why that is. It's used. I wonder if it doesn't have something to do when the market's transitioning from a over to an undersupply. There's something there where there's just an eye of a storm effect. I need to do more research on it. And so I think if you take those slices and measure volatility in more traditional forms, I think you will see them more perhaps lower if you compare them and so forth. I am really talking about, as Marianne's called it, the excursions outside the band, okay? And I take your point about how companies and consumers are feeling that. Let's see, on the, Marianne, your point, yes, that OPEC was not that good. Amen. I mean, if you remember the volatility metric that I put up, we kind of measured in a way how effective Rockefeller, OPEC, and the Texas Railroad Commission were. And I did that by saying, okay, while these folks were running the show, did they sort of compress the amplitude of price ranges based on my kind of average of monthly ranges? And remember, Rockefeller got to a 24%, which was half of what the previous boom bust, so a huge improvement. He had to do it indirectly, as I said, by organizing and monopolizing the refineries and then colluding and coordinating with the railroads and the pipelines. OPEC was also about 25%, never as coherent, as effective, as forward-leaning as the Texas Railroad Commission. And one thing I really enjoyed doing and learning about the most in this book is the mechanisms by which not only the Texas Railroad Commission and other oil-producing states met and every month and created a call on Texas and then assigned quotas well by well, field by field for a month, and then met again the next month and did it again. Imagine OPEC, when they meet, it's every 6 months and no one goes along with the quota. I mean, and forward-leaning, and then those companies, the Seven Sisters, getting together and colluding and controlling exactly how they're going to deliver and price gasoline in Rotterdam and Venice and so forth. I mean, the system of control, whether you, I'm not a particular fan of government control of anything, but oh my, you marvel at it. And that is why they crushed that volatility to 4%. So I 100% agree, OPEC was not as an effective swing producer as the Texas Railroad Commission. As for the excursions outside these bands, I mean, we'll see. I guess we can argue a counterfactual. In my view, the oil price would not have stopped in February of 2016 falling had not Minister Novak and Minister Naimi met in the Doha on February 15th and uttered the words conditional cuts. I believe, I could be wrong, can't prove it, the price would have fallen to shut-in. And shut-in, shale wasn't falling fast enough, and shut-in is probably stripper wells in the United States, very high-cost marginal wells. Maybe it's Canadian projects, but I think it would have been a lot lower, 16.6 or lower. And again, we'll debate, and we should probably get together in 10 or 15 years, but we'll see if a world going from 7 to 10 billion people with a growing middle class that likes all the beautiful things that come from hydrocarbons, if the demand for that incremental crude can be met solely by shale, not only that we continue to produce at these volumes, but that shale as a quality provides us the products we need out of the refining system we have. And those are all issues, and if I could be wrong, but I'm going to suggest that we're going to see excursions outside of whatever new normal range you want to call it. Today it might be 60 to 80. Before it was 40 to 60. It seems when we settle down for about a few months to quarters, everyone decides it's the new normal. But I think we are going to, if we don't see an effective swing producer, we're gonna see excursions. I think were they to be effective, OPEC Plus looking forward, your point is very well taken. Saudi Arabia should be saying, oh my golly, if I really believe this, this story that the Saudis tell about this insatiable thirst for oil and inadequate investment, which the IEA, where Anton works, always talks about, we're not investing enough. If I believe that, Saudi Arabia should be investing in upstream production capacity to 15 or 17, and so should everybody else. So they're not, and I think they know we're going to be tight going forward, and I think we'll see excursions outside there. But let's see, and then I do think they never admit it publicly. Rockefeller didn't. Oklahoma, which is actually the first state, you got to give credit to Oklahoma. Texas gets bigger and they always get the credit. Actually, Oklahoma went first on quotas and everything. But Oklahoma and OPEC, I think, rarely say price stability is our goal. Rarely. It's making sure there's stability in markets, supply and demand is balanced, avoiding big builds or declines in inventories and so forth. I think they all tip around. They do all tip around. The Texas Railroad Commission swore up and down it wasn't about price control. It was about preventing waste. It was conservation. That was what they were doing, not fixing prices. But the dirty little secret, because they know the health of their industry, that the benchmark that those planners and investors use is the price, current and future expected. What officials look at, what consumers look at, what voters look at is the price. That's what they care about. Look at, a great example is last summer. You know, President Trump and the Trump administration wanted to zero out Iran's oil exports. And they said, what part of zero do you not understand? We're going to go to zero. Zero. And the market believed it. And so I'm sure the Saudis came along and said, we can replace all those barrels. As an Iranian barrel goes off, OPEC barrel is going to go up. And you may have thought, now some folks are thinking, wow, if you can replace the barrels, that's just fantastic. Except that's not what really President Trump wanted the Saudis to do. He didn't really care about barrels coming on or coming off or this or that. He wanted gasoline to stay below $3 a gallon while he was driving Iranian oil. He doesn't care about barrels schmerels, okay? And the Saudis and others and Russians, the UAE came up, they did replace the barrels as Iran went off. But spare capacity went down, the price went up to $85 a barrel, and gasoline headed to $3 a gallon. So President Trump had to back off and go easier on Iran. And I raise that as just an example, I think, as a truism, everybody cares about the price. It's all about price stability. And forward-looking swing producers and market management is all aimed at keeping current and then those future, anchoring those price expectations, in my view. But you can see we can have grounds for disagreement.
Could I have a point of
Yeah.
clarification? I actually agree with you. You'll see excursions out of that range.
Yeah.
My point was they won't last more than 10 months.
Okay.
Because you'll start to see production, investment, and
Fair enough.
production coming back in the market.
Or a recession.
So, yeah,
Right.
so it shortens the time that the excursions last,
Right.
is my point.
Right. Fair enough. No, I think that awful things happen at the extremes. You have shut-ins, you have Alberta curtailments, or you have recessions. You kill demand, and then you can have a very quick turnaround. So no, agreed on that.
That's not a good policy. But your example you gave on the Iran sanctions is a great example of how government intervention can make it worse and
Right.
add volatility and uncertainty.
Right.
And we had that coming up again in May in terms of whether the waivers are
Sanctions.
in or out.
Right. Right.
Yeah, you're welcome to ask questions, by the way, both in person and via tweet. There's a question here. Before we get to the gentleman here, we've discussed a little bit the role of shale and whether it changed the picture for OPEC and for the market. What about Venezuela? This is a country that has the biggest reserves on earth, yet production is collapsing, and it's going to probably take a long time to rebuild the oil sector there once change in government takes place. How does that change the story? Does the world without Venezuela look different from the world with Venezuela as far as the oil market is concerned? Marianne, you work for a company that was heavily
Yes.
invested in Venezuela, so you've
Venezuela.
looked at this very closely.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. Right now, I think Venezuela crude has been problematic, and its quality has been declining. So not only the volume, but the quality has been declining to the point that the old refining company that I worked with had actually stopped using Venezuelan oil, even though they were co-invested in two projects, the upgrading projects in their refineries. So I think that the heavy oil is in decline now, and companies are going to have to substitute medium crudes. And that means these heavy oil upgrading refineries are going to be running their refineries in an inefficient fashion. You won't get the same product yield. And why does that matter? We want to have higher distillate inventories going into the marine sulfur regulations when they take place on January 1st, 2020, and you have to blend in more low sulfur diesel fuel to meet the new standard. You now have the most sophisticated refineries in the U.S. who are going to be running suboptimal crude and not having the same product yield. Also, Venezuela will have a hard time selling its crude. Yes, it could probably sell more to China, but it doesn't get any revenue when it sells to China because China, they owe China money. So they either get it very discounted or they don't get any revenues at all. No one really, there's a lot of lack of transparency about the deals now. So I think that you could get more heavy oil production off the market in the short term. I think the long-term question, though, is more interesting. If you were to see stability, how long would it take to get production up and running? And I've actually been talking to the people who did the Iraqi reparations and who ran the program to restore Iraqi production. And the dissimilarities between Venezuela are probably more interesting than the similarities. The fields in Venezuela, in Iraq, and Libya are very large, good resource fields that have a lot of pressure in them. Whereas if you look at Venezuela, particularly in the Lake Maracaibo area, there's a lot more wells, and they're smaller wells, and they may not have been maintained for the last 20 years. So you could get water intrusion into the wells, all kinds of things, from a reservoir engineering point of view, could go wrong. There were probably some quick fixes there, like for example, if you have a desalter down in your plant, you could probably spend relatively small amount of money and get your upgrader running again. So there may be some production you can get within a year, but it will take at least 6 months to just evaluate the conditions on the ground and probably years to undo the 20 years of lack of investment. But I think the biggest issue is probably the lack of technocrats. Both Iraq and Libya had very good technocrats that stayed with the company. When U.S. sanctions on Libya ended and ConocoPhillips went back into Libya, I think we were positively surprised at how well the Libyan National Oil Company maintained those assets. I don't think we see that in Venezuela. So it's actually going to probably, in my view, be a harder lift. But how do you get all the technocrats and professionals back into Venezuela? And also, if the U.S. wants to come in and help, how do you do that? We haven't conquered Venezuela. We may not be invited in. Just because they're angry with their current leader doesn't mean they're going to welcome foreign investment. They still have a lot of poor people whose needs aren't being met, who might be resentful of that. So I think it is going to be a challenging effort to try to make this happen. And I know Bob has looked at this also.
No, well said. No, well said. No, I couldn't agree more, Marianne. No, for you, I think. Yep.
And also the legal entanglements. What are the deals with China and Russia? Do they have liens on the assets? What do they own? Does ConocoPhillips get to reclaim its assets that they lost? I mean, we won the arbitration suit, and all we got from it were a bunch of tanks in the Caribbean. So, I mean, there's still all these legal issues that have to be detangled in Venezuela as well.
Jamie, you've been a regular at the OPEC meetings over the last decades. How does OPEC see Venezuela? How does the Secretariat deal with the problem of having a president who might be two presidents?
So I would say that, one, I agree with Marianne's point of view, which is totally correct, which is that OPEC is always reactive rather than proactive on anything. And then given its State of the Union night, I always compare OPEC is very similar to the U.S. Congress, which is that it is a low consensus organization that only acts when it absolutely has to act. And so they will evaluate it, but they're not going to, they might put out some things and talk about it internally, but it's not going to change their kind of calculation on a day-by-day in terms of that. You've got to actually have that additional drop. And they've been dealing with that for the last, couple of years, where it's basically dropping, the production dropping by 60 to 100,000 barrels a day. So the next kind of big meeting, aside from the potential wedding you mentioned, Bob, is in April. And I think there's going to be talking about so many other, they've got Iran that they've got to deal with. You've still got some instability in Libya. You've always got something that's going on with Nigeria, what's going on with. So I think it's just going to be one more element that comes in there. As Bob mentions in the book, Venezuela was one of the key guys that really got OPEC going. And as he also mentions in the book, the one thing that companies, organizations, fields that cannot cut want to happen is they want everybody else to cut because they can't get it done, and so then they want that price to go up. But I think your point, Marianne, which is that this is going to be very confusing. I wonder if this is going to end up being like Libya a couple of years ago, where two oil ministers were basically planning on coming to the meeting, two competing heads of government, and trying to figure out that. And that I think is going to be an interesting thing in terms of how does that changeover, if it happens, takes place.
Just if I could just add one point to this, and I'll be uncharacteristically optimistic and cheerful on the oil market. If you just step back, though, and look at, which countries on earth have the potential to really ramp up production, which countries, producers have enormous reserves, and are arguably have been for either 20 years or 40 years sort of out of alignment with the rest of the world. I have two countries on my list, Venezuela and Iran. Mm-hmm. And it may be messy, it may be difficult, and the damage may be bad. But I think, and I'm hopeful we'll see this in our lifetimes, perhaps sooner rather than later with Venezuela, when we have governments in those countries that are more consonant with their people, I'm not saying they're going to be pro-American or pro-Western, but when we have governments that can sort of restore the natural alignment of those countries in the international system, entrepreneurial, connected, young and vibrant, and we get investment in technology, and with the case of Iran, it's natural gas as well, and then gas pipelines, it's hard for me to imagine something likely to happen, don't know the timing, and better. So I'm when it comes to those two countries, I think we're going to see great things if we live long enough.
Could I comment on that? Because, you may be, at some point, I think you will be right, but let me go back to 1998 for those of you oil historians in the audience. In 1993, Venezuela undid its nationalization and had the apertura, and a lot of companies and investment went in. It took them 4 years to increase production by 1 million barrels a day, and that was under the absolute best of circumstances. But it turned out to be not such a great thing. Venezuela has heavy oil, and there aren't that many refineries in the Gulf Coast, or in the world, really, that can upgrade heavy oil. So what you saw is Venezuela increased production 1 million barrels a day, the Saudis by 500,000 heavy oil, and Mexico by 500,000. And lo and behold, there was a fight over linking deals in the Gulf Coast with U.S. refiners. I mean, Venezuela signed up 2 deals with Conoco and Phillips. Shell Deer Park signed up for Maya crude from Mexico. And then the Saudis came in and they started the Motiva. So my point is, this is what led up to the oil price collapse in 1998. And I remember there was a day in Houston that we had $11 oil prices, and there was one French restaurant in Houston that pegged the price of lunch to the price of WTI. And so I got to have a consolation prize, a cheap lunch that day. But my point is, you can't encourage that rapid expansion, particularly if it's a very specific type of oil, like heavy oil, that's not fungible, that not everyone can use. You will crater the market.
Okay, we had a question here. If you can just introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
If you introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Joe Allman. I'm a E&P analyst at a private investment bank. I know we're talking about production here, but would love to get your comments on your expectations for China demand.
I will go first, but I will welcome, when I first met Antoine, I believe you were the demand analyst at the International Energy Agency on the oil market report. So I'm going to speak very, very quickly. I believe Chinese demand is going to be higher than advertised and higher than forecasted in agency reports. I believe that the trend in future per capita oil demand in China, so the forecast, if you will, the IEO, the WEO, others, if you look at the trend and the revisions over the last several years, they have been upwards. I believe that in China, as in other countries, there is wishful thinking about the impact of policy-driven transformation and decarbonization of the transportation sector, particularly. And that China, like other countries, when forced to choose between allowing their consumers to access both transportation and other things from oil, that they, if the choice is between letting them access that or restricting that or putting a meaningful cost on that for the purposes of, and I want to say especially decarbonization, local air pollution is another thing. I think that will be more successful. You'll see quality control in fuels and so forth. But I think demand is going to be, over the longer term, much more robust. There will be fluctuations. I mean, God knows with their banking problems in the macroeconomy, it could cycle down from 700,000 barrels a day to 300,000 barrels a day. But I think China is going to be, solidly between 500,000 barrels a day over the long run. It's going to surprise to the upside for oil demand. But that's also a view I broadly hold for most countries.
Yeah, it's always tough to predict Chinese demand. We all know from experience. I think what's striking when we look at China now is, with all the concerns about the slowdown in the Chinese economy, end user demand, consumer demand for crude has been going through the roof. It's never been stronger. So imports increased dramatically in 2018. They were still extremely high in 2019, January. The implied demand for crude refinery throughputs increased 11% in the fourth quarter of 2018, and still about 7.5% in January. So this is massive increase. Even if you had a booming economy, it would be very robust. This is not all for consumer demand domestically. Some of that oil might go into domestic strategic storage in caverns where they're difficult to track. And there's increasingly exports of products from China in the region and beyond. So China is emerging as a merchant refiner. But it's, if anything, the slowdown in the economy might actually increase demand for crude, because I think it's encouraging the will of the provincial governments and the local governments to double down on the heavy manufacturing types of industries that helped China take off in the last 20 years. There was an effort to move from that to consumer demand, but with the economy slowing down, there's going to be a step back and a fallback on the proven recipes of Chinese expansion, I think. So we have a question that came over Twitter, which is interesting, although I'm not exactly sure how to understand it, but I'll...
Yeah.
That's Twitter for you.
Right, okay.
Did you send it, Jeremy?
No, yeah.
Okay, it says, how should an OPEC plus, that was a real swing producer, cope with sanctions-related pressure among members? And does it require more coordination with consumers and sanctions implementers? So the intersection of sanctions policy and OPEC policy.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
question was sort of, some of it's been talked about by the panel, but in this environment of greater coordination of OPEC, plus in the best case, how should it deal,
Yeah.
how should it deal, how can it get more, how do you think about it becoming less reactive, which all of
Right.
you have pointed to, when there's an element of U.S. policy or other policy that might be hard to predict.
Sure.
So take that as
That's
it
a
is.
great question. No,
and
I
I'm
think
Rachel Ziemba.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for that question. I think we should first step back and probably drop in this question, and for this context, the word OPEC. OPEC really doesn't do anything. OPEC is a facade behind which Saudi Arabia, with a little help from its friends UAE and Kuwait, are willing and able to adjust supply. So I think in a way the question is, in this era where the United States is increasingly willing, under the past 3 presidents, to, if you will, weaponize oil, use oil as a weapon, let's be honest. Should there be better coordination? between the United States and Saudi Arabia primarily to make sure there's no policy-driven uncertainty and surprises? I think the answer is yes. You know, I think last year is, again, a great example where there were mismatched expectations. I think we may face that again, as Marianne said, as we come up on May. And we also look at the impact of Venezuela sanctions coming to Venezuela. One of the provisions in the recently announced sanctions, as you know, and one of the licenses will require the service companies to leave Venezuela after July. Now, you can import goons, you can import guns, you can import cash, but it's really hard to import really talented service company workers and who know how to keep, especially Venezuela's oil flowing to the degree it is. And if we order those, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea, I'm just saying let's all be aware that at the same time we're making decisions about how much we're going to allow Iran to export in the second half, we also may be following through, if the current regime, Maduro regime, survives that long, on an order that will shut down the service sector, basically. And that ought to be discussed, whether at the wedding, at the cocktails and afterwards, but there ought to be a discussion about that. And I think there is, to be honest. There's been some press reports about certain State Department officials and certain Saudi oil officials getting together. I think that's not new news. So I think the turmoil of the last half year has been taught a lesson. And so I think there's going to be going forward. But I take your point. It is very important to do that. Wow.
Hi there, thanks very much. Michael Dobson, doing a PhD down at the New School. Here 2 years ago, bought the book, read it, loved it.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Would you like to join the panel? We can move on. Just kidding.
Well, wait to hear what I say next. I was fascinated in particular by the figure of Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, one of the founding fathers of OPEC. And I was wondering, if he was alive today, do you think he would see a role for OPEC or OPEC Plus or a swing producer in responding to climate change and in advancing the transition away from oil by a stable price, not perhaps between 60 and 80, but elevating over time, gradually increasing?
That is a wonderful question, and I have an unorthodox answer for you. As you may know, and I don't think I talked too much about Juan Perez Alfonso, I didn't talk about after he left OPEC, and he became very disenchanted. He called oil the devil's excrement, I think it was. He became disgusted with the oil industry, with the oil curse, what it did to Venezuela. And if he was alive today, he'd probably be disgusted with climate change and the other issues surrounding oil. So I bet you Juan Perez Alfonso, if he was here today, the founder of OPEC, who spent the 50s in the exile in the United States, went down to Austin and couldn't believe that just a bunch of officials got together every month and did a call on Texas and then imposed quotas backed by the police, thought there's a great, that fella, he would welcome the end of supply control, and he'd welcome boom-bust oil prices, because there's nothing, in my view, that is more likely to put an end to oil. And let me put it this way, to incentivize an investment and a search for alternatives to oil, and especially transportation, than continued wild boom-bust oil prices. It was Spindletop and the huge fines in Texas in the early 1900s that came along while they were perfecting the internal combustion engine, which convinced everybody to say, put the electric car away, put the ethanol car away, even though we're going to debate that for the next 150 years, every few years. But it was that abundance and that stability. Rockefeller provided 25 years of stability. So I bet you he would say, let it rock and let it roll. Let it swing and let it flow. Let that price go up and down. I don't want to see an affected producer, because that will put oil out of business. And that's why it's in the oil industry's, conversely, interest to get some modicum of stability back. Great question. Thank you.
Tamara Esner, I'm an energy analyst at NASDAQ. 2 questions. Number one, U.S. shale, the wells decline really quickly, very fast. What is the significance of that over time, if any? And then the other question was sort of alluded to with the spreads, increasing spreads between heavy oil prices and light oil prices, and the fact that shale, which is basically the biggest source of growth outside of OPEC is light sweet, but most of the refiners are geared toward the heavier grades. What is the significance of that, maybe as it relates to IMO or just generally with we talk generally about oil prices, but I think it's really the increasing spreads that might be significant.
Well, I can comment on the shale piece. I think shale decline rates are very misunderstood. Decline rates have probably steepened, but that's because it's much more economic to get the oil out of the ground faster. It improves the project economics. So the oil industry would view it as a technology improvement that they've managed to even steepen what was already a steep decline rate, because you get most of the value in the first 18 months. What people are not understanding is how that translates to a whole basin. If you have many wells that are more than 18 months old, they drop into this really flat tail, and you build up all these flat tails, and lo and behold, in a basin, the decline rates are much lower. So you cannot equate a well decline rate to a basin decline rate. Also, what it does mean for a company, though, is that they need to keep investing capital. It is very capital intensive, shale, versus some other projects that you probably think of being capital intensive, like a deep water project. You're having to continually invest. So I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about decline rates. In terms of the heavy-light differential, it's interesting. Right now, heavy crude is scarce, mostly because Venezuelan production and quality has continued to go down. The Mexican heavy oil production's going down. Canada cannot get more heavy crude to the Gulf Coast. It costs about $18 a barrel to get a rail car now today to take more Canadian crude to the Gulf Coast. I mean, the economics are not very good. So there's a general shortage of heavy crude, so heavy oil pricing has gone up relative to light oil pricing. Also, the OPEC cutback tended to take off more medium sour barrels, so that has become more dear relative to light prices, particularly when you have all this light tight oil. There's a lot more light oil in the world, so heavy has become more valuable. That will completely reverse on January 1st, 2020, when you have to get rid of about half of the 3.5 to 4 million barrels a day of high sulfur fuel oil, bunker fuel in the world. Suddenly, you'll have a surplus of heavy fuel oil, and that will depress the prices. To give you an example, crudes like Maya and the Venezuelan heavy, they have about 35 to 40% yield of high sulfur fuel oil. So those crudes are really going to drop in value. So what we're seeing today will absolutely reverse on January 1st, 2020.
As a shameless plug on your last answer, as a Brazilian, medium sweets in Brazil are probably going to get a nice pickup from that
Indeed.
as well. Fernando Valle, Bloomberg Intelligence. I cover oil majors and refiners. My question was in regards to Saudi Arabia, since OPEC is no longer a thing. Their cost has, you can make a case that their cost has actually gone up, and they were on a fiscal break-even level. And part of the rise in oil prices over the last 20 years was them trying to adjust their balance sheet to that. So the question is, if you really believe in the earlier question on a peak demand within the next 50 years, how does MBS or whoever rules Saudi Arabia adjust that balance sheet to the stranded reserve risks, right? They have outside of Venezuela, they have the highest reserves in the world, and they need to lower their fiscal break even, but at the same time, they have so many reserves that they can't possibly produce it all before we're over the age of oil. So how do you balance that? And if shale can keep growing, how do you cede market share to shale if you're adjusting your production now?
Well, yeah, well, there's different ways of looking at this, but I guess if you do take the hypothesis of peak demand for granted, if you take that as your working assumption, then you're going to have winners and losers. And it's possible that low-cost producers like the Saudis, low-cost producers, maybe high budget requirements, but low-cost anyway, might end up as the winners, because if indeed there's concerns about stranded assets and that inhibits investment in the upstream, the last guy standing will be the OPEC producers and the Middle East producers, the low-cost producers. So it might work out for them in a way.
One other comment on so this discussion about fiscal break-evens and how Saudi and other countries often spend over that. So the number that I always look at is actually the current account balance, which is actually looking at your imports versus exports. So if you look back historically, Venezuela outspent its fiscal balances for years and years and years before everything went to heck. And then in 2014, it was that they weren't able to pay for their imports. And so that really hit, and then that's when suddenly everything hit. So you can actually deal with a fiscal balance where you're not in balance and you're spending quote unquote too much, but it really only matters when you actually are not able to pay for those imports. That's when it really kind of hits it. But it also, I totally agree with Antoine's point. So even if you have peak demand, somebody's still going to be providing that kind of whatever the base is at the bottom, and Saudi is in a very good position to do that.
But at lower prices.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, but I think there's also an effort by those producers to capture the large growth markets, particularly the Asian, east of Suez markets, and there's a lot of investment in the downstream by producers, both Gulf producers and Russia, to lock in that market share. But there's also a lot of investment down the supply chain, down the value chain, in the petrochemical industry, because there's expectations that actually peak demand, electrification and so on, might actually increase demand for plastics, some plastics, new plastic materials, which are made of oil. So that's one of the elements of the strategy, I think, to respond to the threat of stranded assets and peak demand.
Okay, good question.
So, other question, can you discuss the effects of crude hedging by the industry on price swings? So not the effect of swings on hedging, but hedging on swings.
Right.
And why does this not successfully dampen price volatility? Is liquidity in the hedge market for various reasons not sufficient to balance the supply-demand dynamic?
Yeah, you can't hedge the whole market. All the market can do is shift the risk from one party to another, but somebody's holding the hot potato. Someone's holding the risk. And so at the systemic, at the broad market level, again, you can't hedge the whole market. So hedging is a great tool. And I speculate in the book, I wonder if consumers start to see this boom and bust, whether we'll see more, maybe even swarms of consumer hedging, buying clubs, and like they do with heating oil, where you lock in a long-term contract. We may get innovative there. So I think hedging is a great tool. And for consumers exposed to the volatility especially, you're starting to see developing countries go to the World Bank. I think Uruguay has done this and use hedging and swaps and things to get some price stability in their imports. So it's a great tool for individual actors, but at the market level, who takes the other side of the whole market? There's going to be risk in that market that someone's going to be holding.
I would like to add to that the fact that producers in the U.S. hedge means they're less responsive to price drops, and it'll take them longer to respond. So that is not a good thing in terms of market stability.
Do you have any more questions from the audience? Capel?
Does the current distribution model of mainly commodity trading firms affect the ability of a swing producer to actually control prices?
Does the current distribution of the
distribution model? So right now, it used to be Seven Sisters, long-term fixed contracts, but now it's spot oil, Liverpool, Trafigura, Vitol, and then people actually getting oil to consumers. Their ability to move oil around really reduce the ability for that. Does their ability to move oil around really reduce our ability to have a swing producer?
Well, it certainly makes markets more efficient, which means their prices are more volatile in an efficient market. So, I mean, it has that effect. It's more transparent and efficient today.
Right, I agree. And through history, because we have to remember, and this is a kind of I guess I knew this, but from the research really came out, in the United States, we've always had spot markets. And third party, there's never been, well, in the 70s, there were some price controls briefly, but that was an exception. From the very beginning, it was spot markets. And what we did is regulate supply. Even during the period where the Seven Sisters had formula pricing and so forth internationally, and then Gulf Plus, and the book goes into all that. And that did not impede the Seven Sisters from being very effective. But I take Marianne's point, it's, I think, better probably to have a very transparent spot liquid market. But as long as there's effective wellhead control and an institution that's able, willing, and proven success to adjust that supply, it ought to work. It's worked both ways.
I think the role of information in regulating the market is very important, and there is a information revolution going on in the oil industry with new providers, data providers, satellite imaging, machine learning. That's a real game changer, which is just appearing in the market, but I think will have a big impact. Probably reduce some of the competitive advantage of the big traders and level the playing field to some degree, but make it much easier for the market to play arbitrage opportunities. There was one more question, I think I saw it, yes?
Hi, Jeff Maurer at Platts. Marion, to your point about Gulf Coast refiners and their reliance on Venezuelan crude, who do you think is going to fill that gap? I mean, if it seems like a good opportunity, right? So it seems like a really good opportunity for Canada, but it's difficult to get more crude down there. Do you think that pressure, that opportunity will I don't know, somehow change the atmosphere in Alberta or in Canada to actually bring more crude down? Some of the action taken by Alberta recently, I think, had some unintended consequences. I don't know if you saw that Imperial came out last week and said, hey, we can't rail anymore because you closed the ARB on us, basically.
Right. I would like to think that Canada would take advantage of that opportunity, but I'm just not convinced, having watched, their capacity situation or limited export capacity situation of the making over the last 2 decades. So I think what U.S. Gulf Coast refiners will do is they will substitute less heavy or more medium crudes in their coker, and they won't be able to run their coker as efficiently. So they're going to operate in a suboptimal fashion. And I mentioned earlier, I think that will actually reduce product yields, like you'll have less diesel fuel. So it will have an impact on the market. But, and Canada did increase its production. They cut back and they increased by 75,000 barrels a day. But it's that $18 rail tariff and heated rail cars that is going to keep you from sending that more crude down to the Gulf Coast. That's a pretty long distance. Getting over the border, as you know, is difficult without pipelines. And you have heated rail cars, and the rail companies, I think, are asking for these long-term contracts if you want to ship with them. No, refiners don't want to do that. Right. Right. But if they insist on long-term contracts, you're not seeing people signing up for more rail. So, and the economics of an $18, discount off the price because you have to spend it on transportation, whereas a pipeline tariff would be like $9. So the economics are just not good.
Jan?
And then there's a lady down there, back there too. So.
Okay.
Hi, thank you very much, all of you. Jan Stewart with Cornerstone Macro. In the spirit of a wasted Super Bowl and the State of the Union, perhaps I could ask all of you to give us a prognostication on what to expect next on 1, Iran sanctions, more or less over the course of the year, 2, Venezuela, more or less sanctions, and then 3, are we going to see sanctions on Russian oil?
Go down the line. Okay. Iran, as long as Brent is within spitting distance of 60, I think they will take another few 100,000 barrels a day out of Iran's exports. They will cancel some waivers, renew others at lower volumes. So I think they'll take another bite out there. I don't think there's a likelihood of zeroing out. On Venezuela, if Mr. Maduro doesn't cave in the next sort of days to weeks, I think the chances of tighter sanctions are high in the United States. We're very close to secondary sanctions. It wouldn't take much more to make them secondary sanctions, where we really do require every country on the planet to decide whether to work with Venezuela or the United States. We haven't quite got there, but we're getting close. I think any provocation by Maduro, any harm to U.S. diplomats, any harm to Mr. Guaido, any mass repression or killing and things would probably quickly bring us to, at the very least, tighter sanctions. And the third one was?
Russia.
Russia. Oil, no, I don't see. What we would presumably we would. I know I don't see anything likely on that. I think one thing, when you really get into it, even in the Northeast, they take that Russian oil in occasionally and things, and the gas. I don't think they're going to want to, with the Jones Act and the pipeline. I think that even in the Northeast, they're not really thrilled about touching Russian oil. So I'm going to say we're unlikely to sanction Russian oil. There's just too many other oligarchs and juicy targets we can go after without having to go after the oil. But maybe others have a
But
different
Bob, I
view.
actually have a question for you. How
Yeah.
does your view compare with the president's desire to have low gasoline prices going into the election year and sanctions?
The Rapidan Energy Group does a very careful global oil balance, as you know, and we have been and remain a little softer than most folks. So we think that even if the Trump administration, let's say, reduces Iran's exports in the second half from about 1.3 million barrels a day to 800,000 or 900,000 barrels a day, that with the, let's say, lagged compliance of Russia, lagged compliance of Iraq, the soaring growth of shale, which so far is genuine crude oil anyway, we think the president can probably pull that off without risking high oil prices. The loss of Venezuela, however, would put that at risk. So I think if the Maduro regime lasts until the summer, the administration will think very carefully about marching those service companies out. I wouldn't be surprised if we kind of eased back on that, because one thing the president has shown beyond a shadow of a doubt with Iran, and this is very important for the IMO discussion, the only thing the president hates more than Iran or Venezuela's Maduro is high pump prices. And if he's forced to choose between the two, he'll go with getting oil prices down.
So, not easy questions. Iran, I think Iranian supply is much higher than it appears. I think there's a very high amount of Iranian barrels that make their way to the market off the radar. Probably more than half of Iranian exports in the last couple of months were really off the radar. So you have to multiply by 2 the consensus view of Iranian exports to get what the real exports are. That partly explains why the price is not higher today. So I think we're not likely to see more sanctions, I think, on removal of all waivers in May. But even if we do, I think there's a significant amount of Iranian oil that does make its way to the market. Venezuela is a problem, so it's hard to be optimistic. You can be optimistic politically. You can hope for a good outcome of this situation, and it looks like maybe Venezuela is finally at a turning point where things will look up and move in the right direction. But for the oil sector, it's going to be very hard to get the oil sector back on its feet and back up and running. I think it's going to be a question of the precedents that we've had in other countries for rebuilding the oil sector, for nation rebuilding, state rebuilding, and the sector rebuilding, not very encouraging. If you look at Libya, Iraq, not particularly successful. Of course, Venezuela is very different. It had democratic institutions a long time before the current meltdown. So there's a legacy to build on. But it's hard to be very optimistic in the short term, I think. And Russia, I think, so our colleague at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Richard Nephew, who was a sanctions expert in the Obama administration, I think has a view that we are likely to see Russian sanctions targeting perhaps the oil sector with a new Democratic majority in Congress, more momentum for hard biting measures against Russia.
Prognostications? You guys have?
Marianne?
No, I will pass on that question.
I'll answer briefly. Bob's a good friend, so I always dislike agreeing with him in public. But what I would say is, so I agree that as long as prices stay down, Iran, he'll continue to try to go after those, whether there's barrels that we're not aware of or not, I think there's still going to be some additional pressure there. I think for Venezuela, there's going to be additional pressure over the next couple of weeks, couple of months. And then after that, the calculus will also flip to the same sort of calculus as it is for Iran. I think on Russia, I think a combination of there's been difficulty with the Treasury Department in getting sanctions on Russia dialed in, right? It's kind of a blunt tool. And so I think they'll actually probably hold off on oil because of that whole concern about prices ending up going too high. Also, I think there will be probably some recognition that while they are kind of working with this OPEC Plus group, we don't want to, we want to kind of keep that going as long as it is still kind of doing what, at least I think in the president's mind, is his bidding with lower prices. So, but happy to argue with you over a drink there. Yeah.
We had a lady in the back. Did we have a lady in the back who had a question?
Yeah, I think we have time for
How about
last.
IMO? We haven't talked about IMO, and I know we have different
to get to the State of the
views.
Union. We can't. Someone have a question?
Okay, Ed.
Yeah, thanks very much. Ed Crooks from the Financial Times. I wanted to ask about NOPEC legislation. Given everything you've said about the benefits of price fixing and how cartels are a wonderful thing for the industry, do you think NOPEC legislation is completely misguided?
Do I think it's misguided? Yes, I do. I think it, and with this, I will never be confirmed for anything. But I will say what I'm about to say. I think there's almost a direct relationship between how popular and bipartisan an energy policy is and how dumb it is. And I think NOPEC is a great example of that. This is something, though, we may have to actually turn on the stove, heat up the coil, and grab it with both hands to learn the lesson. We are just a tweet away from NOPEC becoming law. It is one of the few things left in Washington, D.C. where there is broad bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle, and the president strongly supports it. He's written 3 pages of a book on extolling NOPEC. And this goes back to, again, this popular memory in the United States that if oil prices are going up and we're being gouged, therefore, the remedy is to take the gouger, to court. And although Rockefeller was not accused of gouging per se, it was nefarious practices, we've meshed the two. And so we remember Standard Oil was broken up by the Sherman Antitrust Act, and so you sue a gouger. And I think we've sort of forgotten the 40 years when we were the mother of OPEC, and with government support and bayonets, we regulated the price almost perfectly. We've forgotten that. And now that the regulator are Middle East countries primarily, with whom we may not be infatuated at all times, when we're being gouged by a foreign country, the natural and obvious, and if I may, American solution is to haul them into court. And I think it would, first of all, I think we'd have to just mail boxes of Kleenex to Texas and North Dakota, because if we actually were successful in dissuading producers from attempting to collectively manage supply, and we saw the full-throated boom-bust oil prices come back. Had we had that at the case in February of 2016 and oil prices wouldn't have stopped at 26, I think we would have seen real pain. And I will predict that if we pass NOPEC and we start to sue these producers, not only will we expose our businesses and government officials around the world to retaliatory suits, because the way you do it is you remove the sovereign doctrine, and that has broader ramifications that are extremely destabilizing. But I almost think this is a case where we almost have to live without a swing producer and maybe outlaw it, to experience what they experienced from 1911 to 1932 and what compelled Governor Ross Sterling to send the troops into East Texas. And I think after a good dose of NOPEC, and if it was successful, we would end up begging them to reunite, get back in business, and start controlling supply.
That was a great way to conclude this conversation. We've run out of time. I think we could keep going for a while, but we have to call an end to this discussion. So I just want to say we have a couple of events coming up. Tomorrow night, there's another discussion of what's next for climate policy with Carlos Corbello, former congressman from Florida, Christina Costa, Alex Flint, Rihanna Gunright. It's going to be moderated by John Elkind, our colleague from Center on Global Energy Policy. And then on February 18th, there's an event on electric vehicle charging in China and the US, led by David Sandelo, Shirley Chang, Kevin Tu, my former colleague from the IEA, and Sheng Yan, our CGEP, Center on Global Energy Policy, man in Beijing. And of course, on Friday, Bob is playing in Bethesda.
Can I, just on that, I mean, on Friday, something you all have been craving for a long time is going to arrive in Washington, D.C., sound policy. And if you can be down there then at the Villain and Saint at 8 o'clock, bring earplugs because it's going to get unhinged. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.